Three world-class players, over $500,000 on the line, and nearly 3 hours of deep-stacked three-handed warfare. When Nacho Barbero, Shannon Shorr, and Landon Tice sat down for the final 3 spots at the 2025 US Poker Open 25K event, nobody expected what would happen next. With an average stack of over 90 big blinds, this wasn't going to be a quick push-fold shootout. This was going to be real poker, multiple streets, complex ICM dynamics, and constant adjustments. The chip lead changed hands multiple times. Massive coolers, incredible hero folds, and strategic decisions worth tens of thousands of dollars each. By the end of this video, you'll understand how risk premium, deep stack strategy, and world-class tournament play combine to create one of the most compelling three-handed battles in recent poker history. Let's break it down. So we're in the Octopi Poker Vault right here, and as you can see, this is the starting setup for the 7-handed final table in this 25K event. We've got our payouts in the bottom right corner here. We've got 529K up top and 73,000 for 7th place, so some pretty steep pay jumps. And then we've got our stack sizes with Nacho Barbero as the chip leader at 109 bigs. We've got a couple of medium to short stacks. We've got 29.5 for Nick Petrangelo here, Justin Saliba at 21.8, Sam Blaskowitz at 30. Our short stack is Clement Deng at 14.7 big blinds. And then we've got Landon Tice and Shannon Shorr sitting on 87.5 and 69.3 respectively. Now, Nacho, Shannon, and Landon are going to be the three who end up making it to three-handed play. And if we take a look at our stack map, on the bottom here of the screen, we can see that Clement Deng does bust in 7th place. Sam Blaskowitz is eliminated in 6th. Justin Saliba busts in 5th. And then Nick Petrangelo goes out in 4th place. This was a particularly interesting bluff catching spot that you might want to check out in the vault if you're able to browse the library yourself. But what we're going to focus on is that three-handed battle. So we're going to skip all the way through to the point where Petrangelo busts and look at this first hand of three-handed play. Now, as you can see, our stack setup here has Shannon at 121.6 bigs, Landon as the short stack at 62.4, and Nacho right in the middle at 87.8. So pretty wide distribution there, but the shortest stack being 60 big blinds creates a really deep stacked three-handed scenario right here. If we check out our risk premiums here on the bottom right corner, we can actually see that they're surprisingly low given that we are three-handed towards the end of a tournament. We do have a top risk premium here of 10.3% for Nacho playing against Shannon, which we would expect. Nacho as 2nd place in chips is going to be under more pressure against the chip leader. But for Landon, for example, to only have a risk premium of 4.9% against Nacho or 7.5% against Shannon, you might expect that these would be higher given that we're dealing with a final table scenario. So it is going to be really interesting to see how these premiums affect the strategies when the stacks are so deep. Now, what separates this final table from so many others, of course, is going to be the depth of stacks. We might be accustomed to seeing final table scenarios where average stack is 20, 25, 30 big blinds. But in a spot where even the shallowest stack has 60 bigs, there's going to be a lot more scope for post-flop play. We're going to have some more complex pre-flop 3-bet strategies. And you're going to see a few things that are very unconventional by traditional tournament standards. Let me dive into a couple of hands here and show you what I mean. We're going to start with hand number 21, so let's jump over to that right here. So this is hand number 21 of this final table, and in the real gameplay, nothing particularly interesting happened in this spot. You can see Shannon has Queen 3 suited, Landon 8-5 suited, Nacho King 9 off. But what I want to pay attention to here is the sizings that are used for the 3-bets for both the players in the blinds here facing Shannon's open. If we look at the risk premiums in the overview here, we've got a pretty high risk premium for both players facing Shannon, of course, because he's a chip leader. We've got 7% and 10%. And then they're relatively low against each other, definitely a bit more on the more moderate side. And in particular here, what we're going to see is that because both players have a significant disincentive to play pots against Shannon, and because their value thresholds for stacking off are going to be relatively tight here, you're going to see bigger 3-bet sizes than normal in this particular situation. So if I look at the pre-flop sim and we go through, first of all, Shannon's open on the button, which he does go ahead and make in real gameplay with the Queen 3 suited. Of course, very reasonable open for him here. And now if we follow through to Landon's strategy, now Landon obviously does fold with the 8-5 suited, and that's a pretty trivial decision for him here. But his 3-bet size in this spot is very interesting. He has a certain amount of 9 big blind 3-bets, which is 4 times the open, which we might expect at about 60 bigs effective in the small blind, pretty reasonable. But he's also got quite a lot of these larger 3-bets to 11.7. So in fact, his range is favoring a larger 3-bet size than normal. And part of that is because hands that might sometimes want to 3-bet for a bit more thin value, like some ace-jack suiteds, some pocket eights, hands like that have less incentive to 3-bet here when it's a bit challenging, a bit more difficult for them to stack off. So his 3-bet range becomes more polar, and he has more incentive to use a bigger size. In particular, this is even more evident when we look at Nacho's strategy, because take a look at this. Down here on this bottom right corner, Nacho's strategy is extremely polar. I'm going to open up the full sim here just so we can really get a sense of exactly what this looks like. This is the opening range for Shannon right here in the yellow. And then Nacho's strategy in the big blind, he's defending pretty wide, but he's 3-betting to 18 big blinds. That's 8 times the open size here at a stack size of 90-ish big blinds effective. So he's really not creating very much room for Shannon to flat call. His 3-bet is very, very polar. If we highlight it here, he's got queens plus, ace-king suited, and then some offsuit bluffing hands. And in order to ensure that his 3-bet range is constructed appropriately, he can't 3-bet hands like jacks, he can't 3-bet 10s, 9s, 8s, etc. because it's so difficult for him to stack off against the chip leader here in this particular spot. So he's going extremely polar with that 3-bet size. He's going much more polar than we even normally would be in a big blind spot. And even though he's defending wide, he can't go with that kind of linear 3-bet strategy. So even more extreme than what we would see in a normal chip EV spot. Now, the hand he actually does have is king 9 off, and this is obviously a trivial call, as you see here. So not really anything to talk about in the actual gameplay, but a very interesting example of a really polar strategy in a deep stacked ICM situation. So let's take another look now at a couple more instances of some of these unconventional strats, and we'll focus on a couple of opening ranges as well as just some of these 3-bet sizes. This here is actually the very next hand after the previous one. This is hand number 22. And as you'll see here, we have a spot where Landon on the button has the option of 2 different raise sizes. He has a 2x or a 2.5x. And the solver is actually preferring the 2.5x here. This is because with Shannon being in the big blind, Landon has to kind of neutralize some of Shannon's post-flop advantage to some degree by making it a bit harder for him to defend pre-flop, going with a larger size, slightly tighter range. So Landon's actually folding an offsuit ace sometimes here. He's folding hands like 9-5 suited, 4-3 suited, 5-3 suited, which might often be towards the bottom of a button opening range. And he's preferring to size up to make it harder for both of these opponents to defend. If he does open to that 2.5x size, we'll just take a quick look at what the strategy responses are going to be. Landon makes it 2.5, which is not what he did in game. But as you can see, the 2.5 size makes it quite tough for Nacho to actually flat in the small blind. He's forced to do a lot of 3-betting to 8.5 here, which kind of allows Landon to either be out of the hand or just be taking it down pre-flop a little bit more frequently, which is helpful for him. If Nacho folds, you can see Shannon is obviously able to 3-bet a lot more frequently since he is the chip leader here, and he can put a bit more pressure on Landon. But it's a similar sort of thing to before where his 3-bet size is going to be quite big. He's going to be defending a little bit tighter. He's going to be folding some of these offsuit queens and folding some of these offsuit hands that might defend against a 2x. So there's a pretty big advantage for Landon to open larger here. Now, this next hand is where our final table and our 3-handed battle are going to hit a major turning point here. You can see Shannon is the chip leader. He's going to open the pocket 4s on the button. Landon folds the small blind. Nacho has jacks in the big blind, decides to come with a small 3-bet, Shannon flats, and they flop set over set. Now you might be wondering how on earth is this going to end without Nacho doubling through Shannon here and making Shannon into a significant short stack. Well, we're going to break this spot down in more detail in a separate video, but just to give you an overall breakdown of what happened, Shannon bets the flop, Nacho check calls, it goes check bet call on the turn, and then check 40 big blinds call on the river. And Nacho does win this pot, but he doesn't get stacks in. Now, it's a very interesting spot. We will go into some more detail in that separate video. So if you want to see that single hand breakdown, check that video out. The link is going to be in the description. But as you can see, Nacho wins a massive pot here. And now he's a huge chip leader with 173 big blinds, compared to 59 and 41. Now, you might think he's in such a dominant position that surely he goes on to win here. But in fact, what ends up happening is, as you can see from the stack map at the bottom, he actually ends up losing a few small pots, kind of draining down a little bit. The blinds go up, he loses a couple more. And in fact, that chip lead starts to erode. And then we get a crucial hand here where the chip lead changes hands once again. So this hand is a big one. And as you can see, all three players getting dealt premium hands here in a three-handed spot. Landon's going to open with the pocket tens. Nacho's going to 3-bet the jacks. Shannon's going to 4-bet with queens. Landon actually gets away from it with tens, and Nacho gets it in against Shannon. And we do end up seeing a big double through for Shannon back into the chip lead. So let's take a quick look at the pre-flop sim here just to examine, did anybody make a mistake? Well, if we go down to that bottom right, first of all, you see Landon's opening range, which is actually surprisingly tight given that it's a button open, but he is under some more pressure here. Nacho has that 8.5 big blind 3-bet, pretty clean strategy right there. Shannon in the big blind actually can mix 4-bet jams and clickbacks with queens here, kind of close between the two. Once he does click it back, Landon does have a clear fold with pocket tens. It would be losing 4K to get it in with tens here. So losing a pretty decent chunk of change for Landon there if he were to get it in, but he does find the fold, which is obviously a great play, three-handed. Nacho gets it in with jacks, and as you can see, jacks actually does have a clear get in here. It's completely fine to go with this one. It's making about 4K for him to go with it. And of course, Shannon is making about 32K by calling it off with his queens once the 5-bet comes in. So in fact, even though it seems like this is such a massive cooler, massive confrontation, Landon played it completely fine, Nacho played it completely fine, and Shannon played it completely fine. So just one where it actually played out pretty much exactly how it's supposed to at equilibrium. Great example of three elite players playing at an elite level at these high stakes. So after this big hand, we do see an evolution in the stack distribution here. In fact, it starts to really close up. We get a lot of very close together stack sizes here. Everybody at about 50, 60, 65 big blinds, until we get Landon starting to pull away a little bit in this particular spot, which we'll take a quick look at in hand number 49. And that is simply a product of Landon opening the button, Shannon defending big blind, check, check, flop, check, bet, call on turn, and then check, bet with the nuts on the river, and then Shannon finds a bluff raise. Now, Landon, of course, does shove, or essentially shove, leaves himself half a big blind. And of course, Shannon folds. So Shannon doesn't get that bluff through here, but probably a very reasonable approach for him to have a bluff with the ace-10 there. We're not going to go into too much detail on that one, other than to say, as you can see, Landon now takes the chip lead. But that would be somewhat short-lived here. He does lose one not too long after this particular hand. And if we dive into looking at the hand where he did lose the chip lead, you can see that it's actually just going to be a really bad beat. Shannon opens the button with fives. Landon makes a small 3-bet in the small blind. Nacho folds. Shannon rips it in for 28 bigs. Landon snaps. And of course, Shannon turns a set to stay alive here. So Landon gets pretty unlucky, and we're right back to this point where everybody has very, very close together stack sizes. So we're going to see a lot more battling over this next sort of 10 to 20 hands here. And then we get to a point where Shannon starts to just pull away a little bit. If we go to hand number 65 right here, we're going to see a little bit of a change in the momentum here. The stacks are a little bit shallower now because the blinds are going up. Nacho opens the button. Shannon flats the small blind with ace queen off. Landon then squeezes in the big blind with queen 4 suited, and it folds back to Shannon. He ships it, and Landon obviously folds. Now, this is a really interesting one. It's not as weird of a hand as you might think. If you look at the strategies here, the open from Nacho with jack 9 off is obviously pretty reasonable, pretty much break even there. Shannon's play in the small blind actually with ace queen off is completely fine. The flat is a pretty good mixed play here. It's not going to be pure 3-bet with ace queen, even though we're three-handed. And then once he does flat, if we take a look at Landon's range, well, the queen 4 suited isn't in the squeezing range, but it is only losing 60 bucks. Queen 3 suited is a slightly winning squeeze, and queen deuce suited is almost a pure squeeze here. So very, very close to a good squeeze choice from Landon. Definitely pretty reasonable. He correctly identified that suited queen hands are actually pretty decent squeeze hands in this situation. So definitely not too far out of line there by Landon. Obviously, Nacho has a pretty trivial fold with the jack 9 off. And then when it gets back around to Shannon, he has basically the choice of doing anything he wants with ace queen, except for folding or calling. He can click it back. He can raise to 20, 27, he can shove. Basically anything that he does here, it's all going to have pretty much the same EV. Bottom line is this is actually a really good back shove by Shannon. Really good play, takes down the pot, and now Shannon once again captures a pretty significant chip lead. And this is the point where we start to see Shannon really take control of this final table. He does peak his chip lead here at a point where he hits about 79 big blinds in hand number 72, and both other players are 31 big blinds or less. There's a little bit of a clawback going on there, but then we see Landon actually bust in third place. So that epic three-handed confrontation, which went on for almost 3 hours, does finish here. And if we look at this particular hand, we're going to see that it actually ends up being a bluff catching spot that is the end of Landon here. Nacho's going to open the button with the king 3 suited. Landon calls with the 10-9 off in the big blind. It goes check, bet, call. Turn is a king, so Nacho has 2 pair now. Goes check, bet, and call again. All very straightforward so far. The river being a deuce, Landon does check, and Nacho just goes for it all. He shoves. Landon decides to make the bluff catch here with a 9 in his hand, which could be good, could be bad. Let's take a look at the post-flop sim just briefly to see how it looks. Now, 10-9 off is a pretty high-frequency flop check raise for Landon. Otherwise, though, all good through the turn. Turn is a very good card for Nacho. He's basically almost range betting it. And then we do see this deuce on the river, which of course Landon is pure checking. Now, Nacho's not supposed to have king 3 suited pre-flop, which does slightly influence the outcomes here. So it looks like Landon's call here is very standard, very straightforward. Nothing really we can say about this spot other than he pretty much just has to call it off. In fact, he's calling it off with hands weaker than a 10 here. He's calling it off with 8-4, ace-8, stuff like that. So definitely has to do a good amount of bluff catching, given how many bluffs Nacho is able to have. So Landon does bust in third place, and then before long, even though Nacho did have the slight chip lead going into the beginning of heads-up play, we do see that Shannon ends up taking down this tournament. So the final hand here, if we take a brief look at that one, as you can see, Shannon's going to limp the button. Nacho's going to raise to 5 bigs with ace-jack, call from Shannon. Shannon flops 2 pair. It goes bet, call, check, bet, call, check, shove all in for pot, and then a call off with ace-jack high for Nacho, and he does lose to the 2 pair. So very interesting spot there. Nacho does find a call off. And in fact, what ended up happening here is all 3 players from 4th, 3rd, and 2nd place all busted by calling off their stacks with bluff catches. So that's definitely not to say that all 3 of these were mistakes. It's just an example that even at final tables like this, we have to have bluff catches in our range. We have to do some bluff catching, not able to just go ahead and fold all of our bluff catches because we just get run over if we do that. So really good, really interesting final table here. Very compelling action in this 3-handed battle. So to summarize what we can take away from our analysis of this final table, well, first of all, we saw early on that there was some larger open sizes, larger 3-bet sizes, these more polar strategies at deep stacks in this 3-handed scenario at this final table. The risk premiums were kind of moderately high, but all players had a pretty strong incentive to avoid a lot of post-flop play in these ICM scenarios because it is much harder to realize equity. So you saw large 3-bet sizes, you saw very polar 3-bet ranges, particularly from the big blind here with that 8x 3-bet size from Nacho against the chip leader there. So really interesting to see some of those pre-flop spots. And of course, in the post-flop scenarios, we did see some bluff catching occurring in situations where a lot of players might think, well, I'm just going to fold, can't really call off my stack here. And in the end, it didn't work out for these players in these spots. But I think the bluff catching that went on here was completely reasonable. Don't think we really saw too much that was out of line in a way that we would start to say, oh, that's clearly a mistake here. So really elite level play. Really epic 3-handed battle here from all 3 of these players. And Shannon does end up going ahead and taking down this $25K US Poker Open title for just over $500,000. So he adds another win to his impressive resume of tournament victories. So thank you everybody for checking out this final table review. We're also going to have the single hand review of that set over set spot here elsewhere on the channel. So make sure you check that one out. And we're going to have a hand report for that hand that's available in the description and also through our social media channels as well. So stay tuned to the channel for more final table reviews going forward and more insight into some of these great tournaments and scenarios that we have in the vault on Octopi Poker. Thanks, everybody. I'll be back again soon.